If everyone's ready. Okay. Item 1, roll call. Present today are Councillors Wingard, Councillor Osher, Councillor Perry, Councillor Mitchell, and myself, Councillor Gardner. I think that Cheryl's not going to be able to make it. Item 2, aligning the town's regulatory approach to residential rental activity. The item hopefully the internet for the state won't go out while we're having the presentation this month. Kyle?
Yep. Hi, everyone. So yeah, it's expanded a little bit since last month, since we had the time to take a further look. Share my screen real quick. Not what I wanted. Okay. Everyone see it okay? All right. So yeah, this conversation is kind of a broader view at the overall approach to regulating rentals in the town, both long-term and short-term. So first, what wasn't really included in the presentation last time, which we thought might be a good idea, is just to take a step back and outline some of the points the comprehensive plan made around the idea of, longer term rentals and short-term rentals at the time, just to get some context for how things have gone the past several years and maybe, where things could go moving forward. Then moving on to kind of how we treat each type of rental situation currently, both kind of the, how it's dealt with in the ordinance and, how we view things in practice. Then taking a look at kind of the range of options, this, regulatory spectrum of, the different, ways that you can potentially regulate rentals, ranging from, not, really regulating at all, just kind of letting it be, versus imposing stricter standards. And then the fourth one, regulatory direction moving forward is really where staff will be hoping to get a lot of council feedback as far as the direction that we want to go with each of the different types of rentals moving forward. So just to start out, the comp plan on the long range side of things, long-term rentals, the comp plan identified a lot of issues and opportunities, and then corresponding to that, identified some potential recommendations to deal with those issues and opportunities. So as far as long-term rentals go, the comp plan talked about integrating off-campus student housing in the town while stabilizing existing single-family neighborhoods, and also finding this balance between, smaller scale student housing within neighborhoods and the larger scale student housing developments. So some of the ways that the comp plan recommended doing this was to enforce existing unrelated people limits. So, we have our definition of family within the ordinance that talks about, you can only have 3 unrelated people in zoning districts where multifamily is not an allowed use, and in zoning districts where multifamily isn't allowed use, you can have 5 unrelated people per dwelling unit. So keep enforcing that. The second recommendation was to define student homes as a land use and regulate in some or all residential districts. So the idea of, student homes as a, particular type of long-term rental that could be dealt with from a land use side of things, not just through the rental registration. Encouraging and incentivizing rental units in owner-occupied situations. That was dealt with somewhat, when creating standards for accessory dwelling units and the village residential overlay that was promoting more owner occupancy and allowing some rentals in those situations, improving enforceability of the disorderly property ordinance, and amending the ordinance to include unruly gatherings provision, requiring owners or property managers to be nearby enough to be able to respond to concerns in a timely manner, expanding inspections of dwellings to single and two family rentals. Right now, it's only multifamily dwellings that are required to be inspected, and amending the ordinance regarding the maintenance of rental properties. So it's more the property maintenance for those non-owner occupied rentals. So on the short-term rental side, which short-term rentals isn't a term that was specifically mentioned in the comprehensive plan, and it's not a term that's currently specifically mentioned in our ordinance, but the principle and the idea of the concept was still applicable. And the issue or opportunity identified here was to take advantage of tourism, visitor opportunities, in our town as a university town, and to encourage a stronger visitor economy in general by allowing these different types of lodging opportunities. So when the comp plan was being worked on, short-term rentals aren't really what they are today. I think things like Airbnbs and we're just starting to become more popular, and so this idea of renting out a bedroom in your house was starting to pick up some movement. But the idea of buying multiple properties for the sole purpose of renting them out on a short-term basis wasn't really that much of a thing yet in practice. So there wasn't really too much in the comprehensive plan as far as recommendations go here, except for amending the ordinance to the zoning ordinance. So we're talking about land use standards here, to create a hierarchy of lodging uses ranging from homestays, which are those Airbnb type rental situations, bed and breakfasts, and hotels and motels. So next, I'll get into what we kind of currently have in our ordinance, where things are placed in the ordinance and the sorts of standards that it looks at. So, but first, just in general, just wanted to have a few comments on the idea of zoning rental activity in general, not specific to Orono, really. Most communities, long-term rentals are not generally something that's considered a land use or something that's zoned. Typically a single family home or a two-family home or multi-family structure, that might be a land use that's allowed in certain zoning districts. But then whether it's, owned by someone or rented by someone is not typically something that's zoned further. So more typically, long-term rentals, if they are regulated by a community, are regulated through a registration or a licensing system. And then, if there are specific property maintenance standards or building standards that apply, those would just apply kind of across the board to all the properties. There is some precedent, though, in other communities for regulating specifically rentals to students as a land use and zoning that. So that's where the whole, student home definition that we talked about a couple slides ago comes from. And the reason for that is that, your typical long-term rental to a family who stays at a property for, multiple years, and, compare that to someone who owns their property, there might not be that many differences. They're both very residential in nature. But when you get into this idea of renting properties to multiple students and the turnover is faster, there's not as much of a connection to the neighborhood, and it can potentially lead to certain things like, shortages of affordable housing, lower homeownership rates, and incentivizing, deferred maintenance by landlords, just because there's an expectation that people are coming in and out faster. Short-term rentals, on the other hand, are generally seen as more of a commercial use that's taking place inside of a residential structure. So like student homes, there's potential for short-term rentals to kind of change that residential character of a neighborhood. But that being said, every community is sort of different when it comes to regulating short-term rentals, as some communities with large tourist industries or based on their location might have high amounts of potential short-term rentals, where other communities might not be as overwhelmed by the numbers of them. So currently in our ordinance here in Orono, long-term rentals are handled mostly through Chapter 8 of our ordinance, the Buildings and Building Regulations section. This is done mostly through the rental registration. So as I think most of council knows, this isn't a licensing process. It's not something, when someone registers their rental property, it's not something that can be revoked like a license would be. It's more of a tool for keeping track of data, and it can be used to determine if proper occupancy limits are being met at a certain rental property. So when we talk about the a property only allowed to have a certain number of unrelated people, the rental registration helps to make sure that that is being enforced like the comp plan had recommended. The rental registration does not apply to transient occupancy, so things like the homestays and bed and breakfasts, seasonal dwellings, those don't need to register through the rental registration. And then, our general property maintenance standards and things like that also would apply to long-term rentals. Student homes, currently, we have a definition for, but they are, and that definition is found in our land use ordinance, but it's not currently zoned or regulated. And I think that was, that definition was put in place several years ago. And the idea was that it's sort of a placeholder. If there was ever a time when, rental activity and specifically student rental activity reached a point that it was causing, so many problems in the town that the council felt a need to regulate that as a land use, it would be there. But otherwise, it could just stay a definition and not really be more than that. Okay, so on the short-term rental side, we currently identify our short-term type rental activities in Chapter 18, which is our land use ordinance. Seasonal dwellings are something that's defined in our land use ordinance. However, there's no real regulation. It's just something that's, like student homes, it's something that's defined that, people have properties and sometimes they don't spend all year there and they might rent out their property on a short-term basis. But beyond that, there's not much more in the ordinance there. And then we have our homestays, which were designed to capture that short-term rental activity. However, as I mentioned before, as the industry has sort of changed over the last several years, the homestay definition doesn't really capture that full practice anymore. So homestays do require a land use permit, either from the code officer or planning board, depending if it's going into an existing structure or a new structure. And it, looks at certain standards like not allowing more than 2 bedrooms to 4 guests. The property has to be owner occupied. It has to be a single family home, no access to kitchen facilities, and it follows all of the other home occupation, home business standards. But that point about it needing to be in an owner occupied single family home is where you really see how our current homestay definition is outdated compared to the current practice of short-term rentals where, people might have a 2-family home and they live in one side and they want to rent the other side out on a short-term basis, or people might buy a whole property in a downtown area or in a remote area next to the lake, with the idea of renting it out on a short-term basis. So things like that aren't currently allowed by our ordinance, but would fall under that general kind of short-term rental concept. So, in the past, we've talked about short-term rentals a few times, and there were some conversations that didn't really, I think, get to an overwhelming consensus about the direction that things should go. So, which is why we're here, kind of taking a step back and looking at things. But a few things it seems that council did agree on and was okay with was the idea that our current homestay definition is out of date, and it was necessary to create a more inclusive short-term rental kind of umbrella that included non-owner occupied and owner occupied short-term rentals, other dwelling types other than just single families, and that using that 30-day mark like a lot of other communities are doing right now, where under 30 days is considered a short-term rental and over 30 days is considered a long-term rental, that seemed like a good mark to kind of split the two. So now we can get into exploring some of the sort of options for regulating rentals. So when I list certain examples of different types of regulation, it's not to mean that those are the only ways to regulate rentals. In a lot of cases, it's just giving certain examples or certain things that the comprehensive plan might have mentioned. So this is a kind of just spectrum of looking at, on the left, we have no regulation. So, when you're looking at long-term rentals, short-term rentals, student homes, which one of these, kind of does council want to apply to each type of rental activity? This is sort of the range of options that we have, ranging from no regulation to a registration, which is more keeping track of data, and maybe certain types of standards, and then all the way up to licensing and land use permits, which, a license is something that can be revoked. There could be required inspections, zoning, which, deals with, allowing something in some places and potentially not allowing it in other places. There's just more regulatory control, and that's usually used if specific issues are identified, whereas the registration might more so be used if you want to keep track of things and keep on top of things, and you want the data to know if things are changing in the community, but there might not be such strict regulation right now through a registration program. So this is just something to kind of keep in mind as we move forward. So these next couple of slides are just going to be some staff feedback on, kind of things that we've seen and felt, dealing with on the long-term side and the short-term side. And I encourage any other staff who are here, if you want to jump in during these couple slides to add in anything, feel free. So in general, in our conversations, it does seem that, long-term rentals in general, not specifically talking about student rentals, but just long-term rentals to families or whoever, create less impact on the surrounding area, just because they are more of that consistent residential feel. There's less turnover, they're less transient. However, as we mentioned before, that can start to change once you start getting into rentals where there's a lot of students involved. Not necessarily that there has to be a change. There could be a house full of students where no issues are identified, and a property, with a family that has certain issues identified. So, but that's the general, I think, trends that staff has noticed. Currently, our long-term rental is handled through the rental registration. It seems that prior to my arrival here and in the past, there were more issues with rental properties in the town. At the current way of doing the rental registration has been effective. And while I think certain things and concerns pop up here and there, that in general the rental registration is operating as it was intended to. Currently on the long-term rental side, only multifamily units are inspected. So some of the potential improvements that we looked at or considered were, how to expand, inspections of these rental properties, while at the same time not putting such a burden on the staff where it would be impossible to regulate or impossible to inspect all rental properties, every year with the staff that we have. So, one idea, that has been, discussed here and there is, something like a voluntary inspection program where you could kind of incentivize people getting inspected, their rental properties inspected, and then, staff can create a list and sort of advertise those rental properties that have been inspected, and hopefully that would encourage people to reach out and want their properties to be inspected, as it kind of gets a stamp of approval, as instead of implementing a program where all properties are forced to get an inspection. Another potential improvement, that I think the comp plan mentioned that isn't necessarily put into place is having nearby property owners or managers available. So creating some sort of proximity where, people have to be within that proximity so they can respond to issues or concerns. And then reviewing our current way of determining occupancy. So right now we have our definition of family, which sets that 3 or 5 unrelated people mark, depending on the zoning district you're in. This sometimes conflicts a little bit with the fire code, and it runs into some consistency issues where, a rental property might be considered as one thing under our ordinance and as something else under the fire code. So different kind of levels of, sort of improvements are required. So there could probably be some work done there to see if any changes should be made to that, if there's a better or more efficient way for us to determine kind of maximum occupancy per dwelling unit. So on the short-term rental side, I think that staff has identified a need to amend the ordinance as far as short-term rentals go, simply because our current ordinance language, as we talked about earlier, doesn't capture the entire practice. Excuse me. So similar to when we talked in the past about food trucks or things like that, sometimes practices in the world advance and outgrow what the ordinance talks about. And I think with short-term rentals, this is one of those situations where it might be a perfectly fine practice, and but for the sake of knowing what's going on at the very least, and being able to keep track of it, the language around short-term rentals in the ordinance should probably be amended. Short-term rentals are more transient in nature, so they create this hybrid between commercial use and residential areas. The idea of owner-occupied properties versus non-owner occupied can play a big role. I mean, there's a big difference between a short-term rental that is an owner-occupied property 90% of the year, and it's just on occasion, those property owners leave and rent their property out on a short-term basis here and there, versus someone coming into a neighborhood and buying up available housing stock, and they don't live there and they're only going to rent it out on a short-term basis. However, short-term rentals, in talking with staff so far, I don't think there's been that much of a specific issue that's been identified so far, but it's also difficult to say and difficult to exactly pinpoint how many short-term rentals there are in the community and how widespread the practice is. So I think at the very least, expanding the definition of what we consider a short-term rental, and even to the level that we consider things like home occupations or home businesses, would let the town know at least how much of a practice is going on, and if more or less regulation is needed in the future. So here, some potential improvements: expanding the definition to include really all the different types. And that's something that was examined somewhat with council in the past. And then, once you have that, once you've created and identified all the different types of short-term rentals, you have the ability to either, create a licensing program or, have specific land use standards and zoning around it, where maybe, you want to encourage short-term rentals in certain areas, but in areas where you're worried about potential housing stock being taken away, there's stricter standards, things like that. So in summary, long-term rentals are generally better handled via registration or licensing. Your typical regulation around those things might focus on building or property maintenance, behavior, keeping track of data and trends, inspections, and having relevant contact info and owners and property managers within certain proximities of the property. Whereas short-term rentals are generally better handled through land use, with regulation focusing more so on zoning, your impact on the neighborhood when it comes to things like traffic and parking, the maximum number of people allowed, or the number of bedrooms rented on kind of that transient basis. And you might have lower levels of review for those less impactful short-term rental types, like the owner-occupied situations. And you might have a stronger review for those types of short-term rentals that are in non-owner occupied situations that are constantly turning over. And student homes as kind of that third piece that we've been talking about, sort of falls in between the two, where it's a type of long-term rental, but at the same time, if expanded, regulation was desired by the council for student homes, it would probably fall under on the land use side more so than the registration or licensing side. So now I'd like to, really get into the discussion part and kind of get feedback from council as to their thoughts on all of this, so we can try to move forward. So first, just talking on the long-term rental side now, I'd like to kind of put it out there to council as to what are in general your thoughts with the current rental registration process based on sort of how we've outlined it so far. if there's interest in expanding to more of a licensing process rather than that registration. Yeah, I think we can start there and then get into some more of the details. So happy to have any feedback from anyone.
Sorry, Kyle, did you want to start with this long-term rentals and then follow up later talking about student homes and short-term rentals?
Yes, correct. So first one is long-term rentals, and then I think, yeah, we'll go to student homes and then short-term rentals on the next couple slides, if that's okay.
That's great with me, folks.
So first question is, council okay with the current rental registration process in general? So I know that we've been working this over time, and that's kind of an open-ended question. I guess my understanding was we needed to get a better handle on rental registration, and so we put in some, over time, then we've created this rental registration. So if you had you have a rental property that's long-term, you have to register so that the public safety, for example, fire, when they're coming to the site, they should be able to know whether it's an owner occupant or if it's a renter. And I guess I wanted to know, am I okay with that? That's my understanding. So I guess I'd want to know whether there's a problem with that and why, if it's, so you're asking if it's okay, but it would be great to find out from the staff of whether it's working for the staff.
Right, so the question really comes up, more so, is there any interest in switching to a stronger licensing process based on, things that the comp plan identified, where it was requiring inspections for all, non-owner occupied properties, and, has council over time heard, from either staff or the community where something like a license which is revocable, is that worth exploring? Things like that, were really what we're trying to, I think, get at. But at the same time, yeah, we were trying to not get too far into the weeds and try to keep a broader view. But I don't know if Sophie or anyone else is there and wants to expand on that.
I think I would just step in by saying the current rental registration ordinance, I think, needs some refinement. I think we really need to be purposeful about the information that we're asking. I think we ask some irrelevant information that we have to because it's in the ordinance right now. But I think that the general idea is, if it's a registration, it's about collecting information. If people then want to regulate long-term rentals, you need to look at doing something different. And where staff generally can have issues is when neighborhoods are experiencing conflict and council wants us to regulate rentals, and we don't have the framework to do that. Or council is asked to regulate rentals, would probably be the better way to phrase that.
Laura, did you have something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the comp plan is quite clear about the concerns of the demographics and therefore the housing market and kind of population of this community, and families, school-age kids are something that this town needs. And I think to attract that population, we need a different housing market in the community. And as I look around, it's the rentals that have kind of shifted the community and the type of population that it's going to attract to live here. As I looked on the town website, it looks like about, if you just look at the map of the town and the green properties are rentals, it's like almost more than half of the town. I don't know what the percentage is, but it was astounding to see how pervasive they are throughout every neighborhood and part of the community, and how many of them there are. And as you walk around through the town, you can see that the level of responsibility and upkeep, because potentially it's not owner occupied, it shifts the nature of the community. And I think that a higher level of oversight on the rentals is direly needed in order to achieve the comp plan goals around the population of the community. This isn't a short-term fix. This is a decades-long thing in the making, but I think we have to take a turn at some point, particularly with the development of all the student housing that has gone on, that is quite honestly a lot nicer and more available and prevalent than any family housing that's available for people looking to move into the town. And so we need to find a balance.
Other thoughts?
My thoughts are that certainly when housing gets run down, it's the owner that we should hold responsible. Whether that owner is an owner occupant or is that owner owns a property and rents it to someone else, when it gets run down, it should be addressed. And we now have an ordinance that's about safety, and that's just gone in since I've been on council, that has to do with public health kind of safety. Like if there are critters living in a house that are, considered a public health threat, that the town now can go in and say, your house, this has to be cleaned up. This is a problem. And we didn't actually have the staff didn't have the ability to do that before. So whoever owns it, making our town safe is something that we figured out how to do. As far as whether it's attractive or not, we drew the line there and said that we weren't going to be able to regulate what it looked like for people's properties. And I'm not sure that even if we had inspections, I think there would cost, there'd be a fiscal cost to having something greater than what we have now. And I'm not sure, even if we put that cost in, whether the staff, maybe the staff can tell us about this, whether the staff would have any greater ability to make the properties look more attractive. And as far as the new student housing looking so much better, it's just new. It still needs to be maintained. And we have a lot of old properties that were rentals before we had all this student housing developments that deteriorated because we didn't have a mechanism to get the people who are renting those to maintain them. And I'm not sure we still do. So I guess I'd like to hear from the staff on that.
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't want to put words in Laura's mouth, but I don't understand. My understanding of attractive housing isn't necessarily just aesthetics. And, I mean, that is correct. We did draw the line and say, we're not going to be the kind of community that dictates the aesthetics of someone's property, but we are going to be concerned with health and safety. But in terms of attractiveness, I mean, we're overwhelmed with long-term rentals that are attractive to college renters, people who, the price can be $500 per bedroom because you're just paying for yourself and you're in it with 3 other people or something. Or, I mean, I've had for the past 3-4 years, periodically been trying to get my mother to move up here from the Boston area. And we can't find suitable housing for her that's near our house, because even when we go, I did contact a property manager. I saw a property online. It looked really nice. It was in a neighborhood nearby, and I messaged him and I described why I was asking. And he said, oh, no, this is a college rental. Your mom doesn't want to live here. And I said, why not? She'd be there by herself. It's not like, No, trust me, it's not, because it's run down and you know, the pictures aren't really accurate of what it actually looks like. So we have this thing where we have a glut of housing that is too expensive and not very well maintained, but that is the market for that particular demographic who can live that way and afford to rent that way. So, I mean, when we adopted or when we began the registration process, the purpose of that at the time was to collect information in case we should need to move forward with regulation, whether that is defining how many student homes can be in one particular part of town, or you know, different things that would just to give us options in the future if that became necessary. We have been collecting information. I think the program as it is now works fine. Would I do something stricter with actual regulation where we could pull a license? Yeah, I would. I absolutely would. And watching what happened on Main Day, not that I needed to see that, but that definitely made me think about it again. I wish we could have that as a stick when carrots aren't working anymore. However, how would we ever afford a program like that? I mean, I would be interested for staff to think about it, but I'm not sure how we would be able to afford a program that does that much active licensing and inspecting. Although I think it would benefit our community, I'm not sure how we can afford it.
I think the key here, when we talk about cost, is for you to tell us kind of your ideas, and when we come back, we can tell you what we think it would take to implement those ideas. I'd rather have you guys have discussion so that we could hear kind of what your goals are without worrying about cost at this moment.
Jeff?
Thanks. I want to say, when I first heard these discussions a couple of years ago, I was on the non-registration, non-regulation side of the fence, because I didn't really understand the depth of change to the neighborhoods and communities that was going on with some of the single family homes being converted to rentals. And I've done a 180. Like, I really appreciate the work that council and staff have done to kind of get a handle on, you know, just the shift to different kinds of rentals and different kinds of residents in town. And I wonder if the burden that we've put on town staff and that potentially, you know, if these trends in, you know, registration, regulation, whatever, continue, could be alleviated by putting the responsibility for some level of safety inspection on the homeowner, saying, if you want to rent, if you want to have a property that is a long-term rental in town, you have to have a licensed home inspector go and complete an inspection based upon a set of standards, and have that licensed inspector attest to that your property meets these standards. That alleviates the burden from town staff. It still maintains the, like, our goal of having safe, clean rentals. And then staff might be able to change, you know, might be able to use the time they're saving to do some of this other work that we may be asking them to do. I mean, I really think that this program has been much better than I imagined it would be. And I really think that I've been educated a lot on how important it is. So, but I understand, like, it's a huge staff time thing. So,
Laura?
I guess in response, not just to the amount of money this might take, but also to the what are the goals questions. Like, I see this as one of the greatest, like, priorities for our community. I think it speaks to our sustainability, not just of our services, but our schools. And I mean, this was a priority when the comp plan was developed, and the nut has not been fully addressed. I don't have the data, but I would guess it's gotten worse since it was initially looked at. And so I think this is worth investing in. I love Jeff's idea of, you know, it not being the town's responsibility financially to provide that inspector, but I also feel like this is really important. And if it requires some investment on our part, I think it's a worthwhile investment. I think it starts to impact the valuation of the properties and is important. So.
And if it were a situation where we had to consider a voluntary situation for financial reasons, I think that the idea that Kyle pitched about, having an incentive like being listed with the town, I think about like, why don't we, sometime in the future, we should maybe be doing something like that where, if folks are trying to move to this area, then the town website might be a resource, or the town might be a resource for helping to find rental properties. I think that it's just really difficult that, when you look at the big picture, long-term scope of things and the type of community that we want to have, when you have like all rental properties being priced too high for people who aren't individuals who probably attend college and may have financial help from their parents, and the median home prices in Orono and the housing stock available, what you're really doing is creating a community where a lot of people just can't afford to live here. They can't afford this nice town and its nice school system and all the things that come with, living in Orono. And I don't, as someone who's not particularly upwardly mobile myself, I really think about that a lot. Like, what type of town is this going to become down the road if it's priced, if people are priced out of it unless they're in certain demographic categories? Tom?
Yeah, I'm kind of looking at this as two different issues. I think there is clearly an issue of balance between rental property and affordable housing for Megan's mother and new families coming in that want decent, moderately priced homes. So that's an issue. And I think the maintenance of rental property and the regulation of rental property is kind of a different issue. I just don't see how licensing and being stricter on rental property, which might very well be a good thing to do, is going to change the housing market in Orono. I think that's a different issue. I may be looking at it wrong, but I just don't see how that's going to. It'll make the rental. We can make the rental properties more attractive. I don't think we're going to make the rental properties. I don't think we're going to change the housing market for families that would like to move to Orono by more control over the rental market.
I have a theory about that, Tom.
Okay, I'm happy to hear it.
My theory is that when a homeowner, and I've had rental properties myself, I have gone through the process, when a homeowner has to pay for an inspection, and then there's a licensing process, and then the tenant's behavior will dictate whether that license gets revoked or threatened in some way. I think that the landlord then becomes pretty thoughtful about who they rent to, who they're trying to attract to live in their home, and how they interact with the tenant. And so if they're saying, okay, well, I'll charge $500 a bedroom, and whoever wants to move in here and throw parties and act crazy and burn the house down, they can do it. But then they're worried about getting their license pulled, and they've made an investment in getting that license. They might think twice about allowing that behavior. So it might also encourage them to look for a different, maybe sometimes make a different choice as to who they rent to. Mom's not going to throw any wild parties.
Well, probably not.
Lori, did you say probably?
So I guess I want to circle back to what Councilor Wingard said. I work with houses, and there is one town in the greater Bangor area that requires a blower door test to have occupancy. And they're actually having a lot of houses built. That's Hamden. And it's shifted what people expect. They think that they did it for safety, but it's turned out that that's like the gold standard. But it costs the person who's getting a house, who wants to occupy it, it costs them more money because they have to get a professional to do that test. So what Jeff is suggesting is something that would cost the person who owns the property more money, but it would not put the cost on our town. And it would be a shift because no one else is doing that in the greater Bangor area. However, we are the town that has the most rentals, probably related to students and grad students and people who are somewhat transient, but still would like to have a nice place to live. And so I actually support Jeff's idea. I had not thought of that as a way to have the inspections, but not have the cost. And, but it would be a big shift, and it would be a signal to the people who are, and when we looked at the list of who are the business owners in town, the majority of the people on the list are people who own properties that they rent out. I think that's what I got when we had that list sent to us at one point. And so it would be a big shift also in how we interact with the people who do business in our town. Some of them would be like, as Megan suggested, as Councilor Gardner suggested, some of them would be like, I'm going to pay more attention to who I'm renting and how they're managing the house, because I had to put in some extra money to do this. And I don't want my license to rent revoked. And other people would say, Orono's too much of a hassle. I don't want to have a rental property there. I will sell this rental property rather than have to deal with that, which would put housing, although maybe in poor condition, back on the market. So I actually support Jeff's suggestion, but it would be a huge shift, and would require, probably our staff would want to investigate who else does that in the world or in college towns or in Maine before we would move forward. And the other question, I think you're right, Tom, there's two different things, which is the problem we have with the lack of housing. You know, that people say put a pin in, but I would suggest that for the future, one of the things we would discuss is there are plots of land that I would like to see Orono invite developers to come develop to make more housing in Orono, as opposed to just letting it out to the market in general. You know, that if someone wanted to develop in Orono, I guess they'd just buy a property. But from my work with people who are doing development and housing, they think Orono is too difficult. So we don't have someone buying up 60-acre or 100-acre pieces of property that are for sale that could be turned into housing developments, specifically because we have a reputation of being challenging. The neighbors, the people who are the neighbors of those properties in Orono are known to be challenging because of what happened with the most recent development, which was already over a decade ago. Anyway, that's the recent proposed development. So there's my thoughts on that.
Laura?
Yeah, I guess I understand what Thomas is, that how this could feel like a tenuous link. I also think that it's a goal in the comp plan, and there's recommendations for how to make it happen. And this is one of the things. And so it's something that we have control over. And I think we have to start somewhere. And I guess I just am in support of this. And I think figuring out what the cost and kind of program would look like that would allow for this. I had a couple questions. Well, I'll skip over some, but to me, long-term rentals includes student housing. So why have we separated these two things out when we are talking about recommendations? Or is it that, like, how are you going to differentiate between that?
So we have a definition of what a student home is. That exists in the ordinance now. And I don't know, it was on one of the slides. I think it's on our next slide, but it calls out specifically, 3 or more students, undergraduate students in a non-owner occupied home, basically. So
just for some history with that, when the comp plan was going through its process, the conflict in neighborhoods between rentals and historic single-family homes was probably one of the cornerstones of the entire process. People were very concerned about that shift from single family home neighborhoods to ones littered with lots of rental units. The original idea with the student home designation was to designate properties as student homes and then limit how much the density that they could have within a given area. So you couldn't have one more than every 1,500 feet or something of that nature. And I think Evan found that in his research with other college communities dealing with the same issue. When that went through the council process, council was good with the adoption of the definition of a student home, but uncomfortable limiting the ability for people to use their property how they wanted to. And so felt like a lot of the conflict had died down. That was the impetus for the discussions during the comp planning process, and kept the definition as a placeholder in case we wanted to regulate into the future. But the idea being in neighborhoods that are traditionally single family or two family, to try to limit how many rental units with lots of unrelated people you could have. Did I answer your question, Laura?
Yeah, and I think it's the crux of the issue, because I think there's a big difference between a long-term rental that's a single family rental versus there's 5 college students living in it. I think that changes the nature of a neighborhood in a unique way. And if I am in support of creating a zone or a land use around student housing and trying to manage that, because if we have defined zones in the community where you can have student housing like we do out on Outer Park Street, then I think we need to have control and uses in our historic neighborhoods for what that looks like. And we are not denying anybody housing in this. We are trying to be clear in our goal of what we want for and need for the sustainability of our town demographically. And this is a step towards that.
It feels like this is a good time to segue to that next slide. I don't know,
Yeah.
Kyle, do you have anything you want to add before we talk more?
No, we can move to the next one, because yeah, that gets more into the idea of the student home. So we'll share again. Okay, can everyone see the presentation again?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, this idea that, yes, student homes as defined are a type of long-term rental, but they are, through the research that Evan had done previously and looking at other communities, and some of those other communities went through court cases, it was sort of something that was identified differently than your traditional long-term rental to a family or someone else. So that definition for student housing was created. A student home, I put the definition here. It's a single family detached, single family attached, 2-family or multi-family dwelling unit in which one or more of the dwelling units is occupied by 3 or more students, which is also defined. And there are some exceptions to this as well. If there's an owner occupant there, it doesn't count as a student home. I think this applies to undergraduate students and not graduate students, things like that. Which we could expand on at I think a later discussion. But yeah, so in general, we have the registration or licensing question for long-term rentals in general. That would apply to, kind of all long-term rentals, whether it was for a student home or for a family who's just rented a single family home in a neighborhood, you know, for a number of years. The student home specific piece though would, yeah, it would become a land use, and then through the land use ordinance, you have the ability to zone that or create certain density standards around that, like Sophie was talking about. So, you know, maybe you identify, you know, certain zoning districts like the commercial 2 district where you have lots of those bigger student housing complexes, or, you know, other districts as student homes are okay there. But in the, you know, medium density residential district, which is supposed to be the primary, you know, residential district in the town where, you know, most of your single family housing is and most of your owner occupants are, you know, maybe you don't want to allow student homes in the MDR, or maybe you want to allow them, but you want to create, you know, certain density limits on the numbers that can exist. And, you know, there would probably have to be conversations on, you know, student homes that are grandfathered versus, you know, regulating student homes going forward and things like that. But yeah, so in general, you know, we're trying to get at, you know, whether or not council is interested in exploring some of those things as far as specifically regulating student homes further. And then, you know, I think part of that process would involve looking into potential impacts that could come up. Because now all of a sudden, if you were to limit or prevent student homes in certain zoning districts, you know, you're basically saying that only 2 students can rent a property instead of, you know, 3 unrelated students as it currently is. So what impacts does that have? Because now you have this group of people who can no longer rent housing that they previously were renting. So where are those additional people going? So, you know, considering things like that, and also kind of looking more into the practicality and, you know, how staff can accurately and effectively kind of keep on top of this as rental properties, you know, from the rental registration process. I think it's, you know, a lot of people fill it out. Things can change from year to year. What might be a student home rental one year might not be a student home rental the next year. Sometimes property owners, you know, they might register and not exactly know who they're renting to going forward. They know they're going to rent to 3 people, but maybe they don't know specifically the 3 people that they're going to rent to, you know, things like that. So this is just more of a kind of a general question of, you know, is council interested in further regulating student homes more than just that definition? And, you know, should staff be looking into these sorts of things to bring back more information to the council? Or, you know, has the rental situation not changed that much in the past several years since council adopted the definition and decided not to regulate student homes further? And, you know, should staff continue just treating it in the same way? So that's some of the feedback that I think we're looking to get. And any other staff present, feel free to jump in if I missed something there.
All right, thoughts?
So if we go back to the comprehensive plan, and the comprehensive plan clearly says define student homes as a land use and regulate use in some or all residential districts. If we're not going to follow the recommendation of the comprehensive plan, we probably ought to have a reason why we're not. And I guess I don't have a reason.
I feel like the conversation that we had when we adopted the definition and we're, kind of working through this a few years ago was really about do we need to regulate the density of student homes? Like, have we reached that tipping point? Because I don't, and what was true then is still true for me now. I don't want students to get the impression that council or the town is saying, well, like, you're bad news. We don't want you in our neighborhoods. Get out to the outskirts of town where we don't have to look at you. That's not how we feel at all. And for me, the important thing in a neighborhood is balance, a healthy balance between single family and multifamily, long-term family homeowners and long-term family renters and college students and other transient renters. I mean, I think that makes a rich, interesting, vibrant community in every zone in our town. But there has to be a balance. And so one of the things that we had discussed when adopting the definition of student home is, this is about setting something in place for if we feel that the tipping point has tipped and the housing market and the neighborhoods are overwhelmed with student housing and it's causing problems. I'm not sure that we've reached that tipping point yet. That's not my sense of the town. And I also feel as though when they were putting together this particular comp plan, before the student housing complexes really kind of, were in there, I think there was so much more tension in the neighborhoods about the student homes. And that was a big hot button issue back then. There still are tensions, but they have been alleviated. Now, the housing complexes have certainly brought new tensions to the town, as I'm sure I see our police chief is on the attendees list, can attest to. But, the tension that really drove a lot of that in the comp plan, the last comp plan, I think has been alleviated slightly. So I'm not sure, we might still not be at that tipping point yet. I don't know.
I think Chief Lowe would like to chime in if you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. So I wanted to bring to your attention, I realize that we're talking about land use and zoning and whatnot, but there's another issue that we look at from the safety perspective when we're talking about student housing. And I know we're going to get into short term, but it pretty much applies to short term as well. And that's how many occupants are inside the building. When we look at permitting versus licensing, I don't think it matters to us in the fire department when we go to enforce fire code or life safety code. What matters to us is our awareness. And certainly licensing gives whatever program we adopt more teeth to affect the change or whatever the case may be. But what we run into and what we have run into isn't so much the proliferation of student housing, but the number of students that are in the houses. And what we're finding is that landlords are actually pushing themselves into a category called rooming and lodging, which is they have too many people inside their apartment buildings. And the problem with that is when you get a lot of people inside the apartment buildings, it creates that life safety risk that we're so focused on. I think we talked about in the comp plan and a few other places. I know that when I first came here to Orono, one of the big issues that was brought to my attention was the Noise Street fire in Portland back in 2014. And during that was an 1800s building where the fire started on the outside of the building from smoking. And subsequently, 6 people died, ranging in ages from 29 to 23 years old. So these weren't like fresh out of high school teenagers. These were people that had some experience under their belts and were just living in a property they should have never been in. And it was because it wasn't managed properly. And there's some question as to whether or not code really had an awareness of what was going on in that building and what steps they took to mitigate it. So I think it's important that as you look at what level of control you want to have of these properties, both student and short-term housing, that you take that into consideration. Our code is blind to the town ordinance, meaning we have to follow the code. It's state law. So whatever you adopt for land use regulation or however you want to set your standards is fine. It just makes it more difficult for us to go in and administer the code and make sure that we have compliance of the life safety code and other applicable codes when when we go in to do that enforcement action. So just something I wanted to throw out to you all for some food for thought.
Of how our code is inconsistent with the state's life safety standard.
So Kyle, I think you might be able to catch me on this. I've been so focused on where we are. I think our code right now talks about, for your land use regulations, it talks about relationships and number of people that can actually occupy a dwelling or a living space. So for fire code, and it gets a little tricky. I would have to actually probably make you a flow chart to give it to you so it's completely clear. By fire code, I'll give you an example. You could have a family of 15 people in your house. By fire code, you're only allowed to bring in a maximum of 3 more people for you to be able to have them rent space within inside your building. If you went to 4, then that would kick you to rooming and lodging. I believe the code, and Kyle, again, correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe the ordinance for the town right now counts like a mother and a single child, or a mother and 2 children as one person. Fire code does not allow that. And there's a lot of history and background that goes behind that. But essentially what it is that the property owners, it tightens it tightens our authority over how the property is managed. And it makes sure that there aren't so many people in the building that the property owner, who's ultimately responsible for those tenants in the building, isn't overwhelmed, and they're going to take responsibility for the tenants that are there, if that makes sense to you.
So the piece that I've learned that's kind of interesting is that when Jeff talks about what's allowed or not allowed, under fire code, there are lots of things you can do. He's not saying you can't have more than 3 outsiders. It just means that what you need to do for life safety in the building is a lot different. So when you have a single family home and you put 4 people who are unrelated in it, you have to meet a rooming and lodging standard as opposed to a single family home standard, which my understanding is that includes a sprinkler and other things like that is, would be costly.
It does. And there are a few occupancies that we have come across in the town that we're working with now that are in that type of scenario. So it's not an all or nothing thing. We work with them to develop a plan, and we take into account their financial situation and what their abilities are and those types of things. So we definitely work through the process, but those are things that we're encountering, and a lot of them we've stumbled into by accident here within the community.
So how did we reach the point where our ordinance is not matching the code? And also, well, go ahead.
I think that the ordinance for Orono was set up for land use purposes and for your rental registration purposes. And I don't think a lot of consideration was given at the time about tripping into rooming and lodging or going into another category beyond that. I don't think it was considered. I don't think it was a fault of anybody. I think it was just an oversight. And I think with me coming in with a different set of eyes, with experience in the fire code, we were able to pick up on some of that and say, hey, this is a problem. And it's not just a problem because I think it's a problem. It's a problem that I can justify and point back to things. So I think without that knowledge base, if you will, and I don't mean that may sound insulting. I don't mean it to be, but I think without that experience of working specifically with that code, it's potentially easy to overlook.
Is this true in a lot of communities? Like, you may not know the answer to that, but like, is Orono an outlier, or is it pretty common that this doesn't match up?
I don't think Orono is an outlier. I think that in smaller communities like Orono that either don't have somebody specific to the fire code, like they just have a single code enforcement officer, or the fire code isn't looked at as closely as it is here in the community. I think that's where you run into problems. I think probably bringing me on board Probably it maybe wasn't a good thing. I don't know, but I certainly have. This is a concern for me, and it's important you guys understand it.
So Chief just celebrated his 3rd anniversary with the town on Friday. So I think it's a good thing that we brought him on board. But I would say that I do think Orono's an outlier in the life safety inspector. When we talk with the state, for the size of our community, it is very unusual. However, look at our rental property, look at our multifamily property, which for the, you know, I mean, I think Orono is an outlier in general, and we like it that way.
Dave, I'm sorry, you've had your hand raised very politely for a while.
Unfortunately, Sophie and Jeff tend to steal my thunder, but so I'll just basically want to agree with what they've been saying, but also look to give this explanation from a different viewpoint. Is that Sophie is 100% correct? Is that communities that, you know, we're not a we're fortunate to be able to have a life safety inspector here. Most of the communities our size or and smaller don't have that, and so that all of these ordinances tend to be created on the building code, and so you have a situation, and Jeff and I have been discussing this for 3 years now, is that the International Building Code, which is what our building code and the state's adopted building code has definitions that are in line with our ordinances. That is exactly where they came from. Unfortunately, the state also adopted the life safety code, which is in a completely different code. And there are multiple things with these particular codes that completely conflict with each other. The state has done a fairly good job of trying to identify where those conflicts are, and adopting corrections to them to dictate which code is prevalent in a particular area. This hasn't been one of the areas that has been, in my opinion, properly taken care of. And I support Jeff's position 100%, is that our goal on the community development side was to ensure that renters are in a safe place, whether they have the deck is 2 inches too high or whatever. From a building code standpoint, really isn't as high of a priority for us. Is the fact that if someone in a house that is not their own has to get out in an emergency, that they can do that in a safe manner. And the only way to do that is that life safety, you know, looking at the life safety codes. So I do think that our ordinance need to be looked at and be able to have those conversations and bring it in line so that there's some consistent messaging with it. For us, we don't care what the occupancy is, the number of it is. I mean, it's not important on the building side of it, but it is important on the life safety side. So we support what Jeff's trying to accomplish as well.
Okay, so I know that Laura did have a question, but I also see our police chief is signed on, so I'm not sure if he wants to jump in. Laura, is this before we move on?
No, I defer to the police chief.
I've been prodded by my boss to maybe talk to you're mentioning the tipping point in certain neighborhoods. I can say that this year it does seem like the Webster neighborhood is seeing greater numbers of gatherings. And I don't know, I guess I should have researched this. I don't know if there are a couple more houses in the area that are now rentals that haven't been problems in the past, but it does seem that we're getting a little cluster in the North Main Pond area. And we kind of got a handle on it years ago with the ordinance that was developed by just really kind of getting a better relationship with all of the homeowners and the property managers. and them taking some steps to tighten up their leases. But yeah, this year it does seem to me that there is an increase in the neighborhood being bothered by the numbers of student rentals in the area. I don't know, the sensitivity may have dropped also slightly, but we're definitely getting more calls.
Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of share my perspective on the tipping point piece by sharing my screen, which is off the town website. And that's not the page I wanted to share. Neither is that. Wait, what are you seeing? Are you seeing the town of Orono? You are?
It looks like the
okay, good.
yeah, snap.
I was worried there for a minute. So I feel like looking at this map, we are at a tipping point by the number of properties that are defined as rentals by our town. And that when we know we want to shift the demographics, it's one way that we can approach this to tighten up this market and make it more of interest to potentially different demographics and reduce some of these other challenges. Like, I guess I see no downside to doing this at this time. And I think it's long in coming for how long ago the comp plan was developed. And in talking to community members, I think they thought by those big student housing complexes being built that the situation would start to shift the other way, and that's not what they've seen, and that they are waiting for this as well.
Right, but that map isn't just college house. I mean, that's not just student homes. That includes all kinds of rentals. Yeah, so when I say tipping point, I'm not talking about like rentals versus property owners. I mean, you know, whether college students are overwhelming a neighborhood with behavior that's causing tension in the neighborhood, not necessarily how many properties are rentals and how many are owned.
But we don't have a measure of the other. So this is unless I am missing something, we don't have the data on which is which. We've defined one, but we haven't tracked it, right?
So one of my suggestions is that we, in our data, that we're asking for student home, is it a student home as defined? And that we give it a different color on our rental registry. And my guess is that the brilliant assistant town manager who does this sort of thing can figure out a way to make that happen.
Yeah, and one thing that I was going to say, kind of in response to Chief Ewing's comment about, like, say, the Webster neighborhood. I used to live in that neighborhood, and that's historically a difficult neighborhood for college activity. It got better for a while, and then maybe it's getting worse again. But I mean, I would be comfortable exploring licensing that can be pulled before I would be comfortable limiting the density of student homes or excluding student homes from certain districts. A hand from Dave.
I apologize for the slowness. Everything I'm doing is left-handed, and it really stinks trying to work everything with your left hand. So sorry for you lefties out there. Just to give some input and perspective on what that impact is that every year we send out rental registration applications to property owners who were registered the previous year. We have been getting back an unusually large number. This past year, we got a large number of them responses back from those people saying that we're not renting that property anymore. And so those applications kind of go into a holding file and in case they want to be able to do it in the future. So as far as having a pulse as to how many, what the range is of rental properties, now I'm not talking about student housing, I'm talking about all rentals, is that we're probably seeing less than we had in the past. And I acknowledge that that number looks big, but again, that's all rentals. And I love Sophie's suggestion of changing the color. It would actually help us as well. And I think it's a valid thing to be able to do. Second thing is that, again, we are seeing the sales of properties through the assessing office as well as through the rental registration, because when a property transfers, we automatically send them a letter saying your previous owner was a rental property. You may not be aware of our rental registration program. So if you are going to be renting it, here's the process. And again, we've received a lot of comment back from them stating that that they weren't going to be using it as rentals. We had probably three or 4 years ago, we had a big number of, we had two property owners that owned multiple student rental properties. And we were commenting in-house that when those sold, probably half of them went back into single family housing, did not stay as single family, I mean, as rental units. So I just offer that as we do see a number of rental properties as each year goes, with that kind of the flow of the ebbs and flows.
Thanks, Dave. And that does actually bring up another point we haven't mentioned so far, which is that part of the reason why student homes as a definition is important is because student home doesn't always equal rental property. Other comments on this before we talk about short-term rentals? Tom, are you trying to unmute?
Yes. I just don't know where Kyle would go with direction based on our discussion on long-term rentals.
I think I would sit down with all of staff and see, get a bunch of opinions. I mean, there's certainly, I think there's certainly been a lot of opinions on different pieces that I have to digest. I don't know if I feel as though there's been a consensus on any one thing so far, which, I mean, can be okay. I mean, you know, possible next steps could be bringing more information on, you know, certain aspects that counselors have raised. But yeah, as far as, you know, nailing down a single approach going forward, I'm not sure that I feel so.
It seems like we're all pretty interested in knowing more about regulation. It seems like we're all pretty interested in knowing more about how to be more compliant with the life safety code, because I didn't know that was happening. And that seems like a big red flag. And then as far as the question of student homes, it just seems like maybe we need the non-consensus that we have on that topic just seems to need more information so that we can make an accurate determination about whether we do need to step in to regulate it in a particular way.
Sure, and I think to the police chief's point, you know, things like, and the comp plan recommendations at the beginning talked about amending the unruly gatherings ordinance, and there was mentions of additions to the property maintenance standards. I don't know if it's just zoning and limiting student homes or nothing. You know, I think there are probably options in between as well that could go to helping out some of the issues that counselors have identified. Yeah, that, you know, maybe help the problem in smaller steps before just, you know, fully committing to, you know, restricting an activity altogether or something like that. So I think those are some of the things that we could maybe explore more and get a better handle on to present.
And what I took away from this conversation is that council likes our multidisciplinary approach. And when we come back to you, I think that's the way we need to approach this issue. And not say we're headed down a particular path, but give you some options along multiple paths.
All right, should we talk short-term rentals?
Sure. Okay, share my screen again. Okay, so short-term rentals, as we mentioned before, right now, don't deal with rental registration or any sort of licensing process at all. Our homestay definition and land use is solely dealt with under the land use ordinance. You know, but the big issue that seems to be there is that it only applies to this very specific type of short-term rental, you know, this single family owner occupied situation. When we know that there are short-term rentals going on in town that fall outside of that, you know, they fall into that non-owner occupied short-term rental type of situation. So the first question, which I think we've answered in previous discussions, but as we have some new council members since that past discussion, you know, does council wish to further expand and define the concept of short-term rentals under the land use ordinance? And this would really just be to cover the full activity, not speaking to any sort of regulation. If so, you know, what level of regulation and standards should be considered? I think this is where, when we talked about it previously, things started to break down. It seemed that some members of council wanted to, you know, let people do with their property, you know, what they want, like, you know, any sort of rental property. Whereas some, you know, identified, you know, more on the side of short-term rentals, like a home business, you know, you're starting to get more into that commercial territory. And, you know, there's potential there for certain types of land use impacts to a residential neighborhood if you just allow that activity with no sort of restrictions. So, you know, things that we could look at are zoning the different types of short-term rentals. You know, maybe you want to allow all types of short-term rentals in the downtown and, you know, the agriculture district out by the lake. So you're capturing more of that tourist and vacation type activity, but maybe you don't want to allow those non-owner occupied short-term rentals in the MDR, where you're going to have whole units taken out of the, you know, housing availability for owner occupants or long-term rental situations for families, you know, to be used for just short-term rentals. You know, should there be limits on occupancy? You know, aside from the conversation we, you know, already had around that, you know, talking about our current definition, you know, of family, where, you know, let's say you might be allowed to have 3 unrelated people, but on, you know, is that appropriate for a short-term rental where you could have, you know, 3 families of 4 people each, all in a single family home and still meet that definition, which is why I think our, you know, existing homestay language talks about, you know, limiting it to 2 bedrooms and 4 people and moving away from that 3 unrelated people. So, you know, things like, you know, maybe maximum parking spaces, you know, that can be used by a short-term rental. You know, this is consistent with how we treat like home businesses can't have more than 4 spaces on the property dedicated to the home business. So you get away from the idea of someone in a single family neighborhood building a big parking area in their backyard and running more of a, you know, a lodging or, you know, getting into hotel territory rather than just a smaller scale short-term rental. So those are the types of things that could be regulated under the land use ordinance. There could obviously be others. Beyond that, you know, there are certain land uses or certain activities that are treated as a land use and receive a license. So think of like restaurants or drinking establishments where they are they get their land use approval and follow those standards, but they also get a license. You know, that could be something explored here as well. Or is the simple idea of having land use permitting and keeping track of the data and the number of short-term rentals that way enough? You know, really, you know, depends on what council wants there. If licensing is preferred, you know, what are council's thoughts on level of regulation? And that's, you know, where licensing would differ from, I think, the land use side of things is things like requiring inspections, requiring property managers to be nearby, having dedicated contact information for maybe town departments, you know, posted in the short-term rental unit, things like that. So that's sort of the difference between the type of regulation that you might see on the licensing side versus the land use side, which would be more of that zoning and impact on the neighborhood type of thing. So with that, open it up to any comments.
Thoughts?
I would just say I see a big distinction between somebody who has a spare bedroom that they put on Airbnb, or that goes out of town for a long weekend and puts their whole house on Airbnb, and somebody that buys a property specifically as a short-term rental investment property. So whichever way council decides to go, I think I'd like some language that recognizes that and doesn't inadvertently kind of make people who are doing, you know, an opportunistic one-off Airbnb thing non-compliant with the regulation or law.
Yeah, my main, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go. You're the boss. You go ahead.
Okay, my main concern when it comes to short-term rentals, particularly like the Airbnb style situation, is just that what you see in communities all across the country is this, I mean, it's kind of like a version of gentrification of folks buying up properties in popular areas and using them only for Airbnb, which negatively impacts the rental stock and also makes it impossible for people of lower socioeconomic status to live in those areas. And that's a problem. And do I think that Orono is there now? I don't, but is it something that we should be thinking about? Probably, because in the past, maybe we weren't as forward thinking as we could have been about how this, I mean, to be fair, we didn't know what Airbnb would turn into, but still. So when I look at this sheet of, you know, possible things that we could do, I mean, I'm interested in all of them, except for I'm not quite as sold yet on should zoning for STRs be explored, different types in different areas. This is, to me, it's the same thing as the student housing. Like, I'm not quite sure that we're there at that tipping point, but one of the things that would help us have a good finger on the pulse of whether that kind of regulation were necessary in the future is having more information. And the way that we have more information is through a regulatory process of, you know, knowing what properties are being used in this way, knowing where they are, and, you know, the registration and licensing type process. Like, I am interested in that. And I think that it does make sense to think about maximum parking spaces for the reason mentioned, and you know, getting data basically from a registration process. I'd have to talk or hear more about licensing. On the one hand, I've always felt like, why would we let, you know, for somebody who is basically operating the same way Tracy does at the Black Bear Inn or something, you know, or you're buying a property, you don't live there, and you're just renting it out. Why wouldn't we have the same, why wouldn't we treat them in a similar fashion in terms of regulation? But I agree with Jeff's point about, I think that owner occupied properties, short-term rentals where it's just a bedroom or you're just going out of town for the weekend, that does seem like a different thing. Because for me, again, the main concern is this becoming a business enterprise and eating up a big portion of the available rental stock. So that it can just be always an Airbnb. That is the thing that I'm most concerned about. So I'm not as concerned about the person who just wants to rent their you know, apartment while they're away for a month or something like that. Other folks?
So my point back to Councilor Wingard is I wonder if we could look at short-term rentals a little bit like we did food trucks. And I know that that's probably an odd combination, but with food trucks, we said the one-off, the X number of times a year should not rise to the level of impacting the neighborhood so much that it needs to go through any large process. And it's a simple permit that you get from code. But if you're doing more activity than that, you're gonna have a food truck come and hang out on your front lawn all summer long, then that is gonna have a different impact to the neighborhood. And therefore there is a process that your neighbors are notified and you have to go in front of the planning board and get permission. So I just wonder if we kind of looked at it in that way, to say a certain amount of activity is just a simple process. A more robust level of activity would have an impact on the neighborhood and therefore should be permitted.
Yeah, I would just follow that up, that I think a lot of communities that do regulate them, but in general allow them, do kind of split them up into that kind of tier system, you know, breaking them down into, you know, whether it's how many days it's happening in a year or the type, you know, that kind of non-owner occupied situation where no one is ever living at the property. That's usually identified as the highest tier, and that tier is generally the most regulated, whereas the other ones might, you know, the owner occupant who's just renting out a bedroom every once in a while, yeah, you make the process for them fairly low effort and easy to do, because, you know, you want to promote that activity and you want to promote property owner being able to use their property how they want and make that supplemental income. Yeah, and it's not so much that you want to limit those non-owner occupied ones even, or prevent them, but yeah, just have them go through at least a higher level of review. And that's similar to how we treat home occupations as well, where home offices and workshops where people aren't coming to the property, you know, simply get a permit through the code office, but home businesses that do start to bring outside traffic to the property go to the planning board for review. So I think there is some existing examples like that in our ordinance.
I like that that concept, and I think that would be a good thing to pursue. I also am really clear, it's clear in my mind that our definition of short-term rental has to change to include everything that's happening now, which it doesn't, and you mentioned that, Kyle. And the other thing that in your presentation that really stuck out to me is that the definition of occupancy we need to look at. If 12 people can be in a short-term rental because there's 3 families and they only count one person or one for each family, that's something we really need to look at.
Right, and it's unlikely a property owner with a short-term rental would want to rent, you know, in a situation like that. But yeah, technically under our definition of family, you know, you could have a situation like that come up. So.
Any other thoughts or questions, comments? Sounds like no. Is there, Kyle, did you want to go all the way to, no, I guess I'm looking at the conclusion slide here and we kind of did that, right?
Yeah, I don't need to put that one up there. That was.
Is there anything in particular that we haven't talked about or has been too fuzzy for staff direction?
Sorry, trying to take notes at the same time. So yeah, I think the short-term piece I think is pretty clear based on the feedback, and I think that there, as we talked about with the other side of things, I think there's enough there to at least bring back council more information to go into more detail about the long-term rentals and student home pieces.
All right, well then perhaps we're ready to move to item 3, which is a brief town manager's report.
It's exciting here at Town Hall this week. So I don't know if people have been paying attention. I know that Council Chair Perry has certainly been paying attention to LD 328 that has passed the House on a 144-1 vote and the Senate on a 33-1 vote that would restore revenue sharing retroactive to January 1, 2021. So if we restored revenue sharing to 5%, it's at 3.75% right now, that would be approximately $600,000 more revenue in our budget. It comes with a fiscal note of around $22 million. So it is heading to the appropriations table. There's a saying that sometimes things get funded on the appropriations table and sometimes things die on the appropriations table. So we are patiently waiting. This is further than we've gotten in my time here in Orono. So I am a little bit positive. I was hoping to be able to give you a whole bunch of new summary sheets and an overview of the budget that would be so rosy because we would have just a huge shift. I don't think we're going to have an answer in time to do that. But I will tell you that on Thursday, we are looking to look at the budget with the general overview and also public safety. So police and fire, our two chiefs will be back with you. My intent for that meeting is to start out with a general overview, probably 5 to maximum of 10 minutes of a presentation with some slides to help kind of focus people. And then I think staff and I feel like we've given you lots of information in the budget to review. My hope would be that while we're always happy to talk about line items, given what the budget looks like, I hope that we can spend our time answering council's questions about service level needs, a higher level. If you have specific questions, especially if you're going to want tons of data from me to help shape a conversation you want to have, if you could just let me know, I would take time Wednesday to try to pull that for you. The overview letter should be out tomorrow afternoon, which would give you 2 days to look at it before the budget meeting. The budget's been printed, so we will start tracking changes. I found an error in the budget where we applied a COLA to people who had gotten steps, which I need to back that out, but that's to the good. So we like that. And the school has a new number from their preliminary number, which should be a shift of, the way I read it, about $300,000 to the good as well. So I'm gonna confirm that and get out some new summary sheets for you. Just be aware that when I give you new summary sheets, it means the detail in the budget isn't going to match exactly, but we give you a list of the things that we're changing when we do that. Does that make sense? For new counselors, please call, write, text, whatever works, to get whatever questions you need answered. I don't want to lose you in this process because the input is really important. Stimulus money. So this is the $1 million that the town is expecting in federal stimulus funds. We are getting a better picture of how that's going to be delivered. We are a small community, so it's likely going to flow from the state. We've gotten some information on how to make sure we've got our ducks in a row to be able to accept those funds. We have, we received word from Congressman Golden's office that our project for Main Street was not considered, well, it was considered, it isn't going to be moved forward for more federal funding. When we look ahead, we've got some exciting operations happening. The 14th of May through the 16th of May is no ticket days at the landfill, which means as long as you have your sticker, you don't get charged per cubic foot. We encourage people to please come in and get their sticker. I am not going to be in town, and in the past I've been around to get people stuff that they need, but I'm headed out of town that weekend.
So excited for this dump for today.
Oh,
my husband's got the yard looking like Sanford and Sons right now, so I'm really looking forward to this.
So starting tomorrow, people who have their brush out tomorrow, brush and leaves, we're going to do our cleanup. We would ask, sometimes people see the public works folks go through their neighborhood and think, oh, it's time to put it out, and then put it out. The goal was to have all of it out by tomorrow. So if they haven't come to your neighborhood yet, after the end of tomorrow, you might have a little bit of extra time. But we have a lot going on, so we don't have time to do lots of sweeps. So please get your stuff out as soon as you can if you'd like it to be picked up at curbside. Brush and leaves, clean material, brush and leaves can be taken to the landfill as long as you have a sticker with no tickets. So you can take your own anytime you want. Also, the weekend of on May 15th, we have the virtual street and stream cleanup. So we're going to meet our MS4 permit requirements through Zoom, which should be super exciting. People who have any questions should contact the town office. Belle is shepherding that process this year. So moving ahead this week on Wednesday, I would like to invite any counselor who is interested in joining the attendees list for a change to join the Orono Tree Board as it receives a presentation on emerald ash borer preparedness and mapping. I'm excited. I'm going to try to run the Zoom for that meeting. So it should be really exciting. On Thursday, the 6th, we've got the budget workshop. Monday, the 10th, we've got the council meeting with a brief discussion about the mask ordinance, just wanting to check in to see where council is with wanting to, whether we want to continue that mask ordinance or if you're ready to pull back on that. And we also have Roger Huber with us, who is the town attorney, to do an elected officials workshop. Goal is to try to keep the council meeting as brief as we can. If you've got any concerns when you see the agenda around what's in consent, please let me know so that I can plan with Council Chair Perry to what might get pulled off that consent. And the 13th of May, we have a budget workshop for Public Works, WPCF, and facilities. So the other thing I wanted to take just a couple of minutes, I still have the police chief here. We experienced Main Day on the 28th, and I just wanted him to give you a brief update on what the day unfolded like and what we're thinking would be a good path forward.
Hello again. So I'm in a good place this year when it comes to main day. So I'm not showing up all annoyed and angry about the way people behaved. We approached this year differently, which is how we had planned to approach it in 2020 and just didn't have to. We took, and actually this is another impact that Chief Lowe had. We kind of took a look at the year before, 2019, and saw a lot more high-risk behavior from the crowd that formed at the Ave. There were a lot more transports and there were a few more fights and a few more arrests than we were comfortable with. So we decided to take an incident management approach to the next main day, which turned out to be this one. And we met with the state police. They have an incident management assistance team. And they also brought their crowd management experts and chose to take a position at the University of Maine with an incident management truck, teams of crowd management guys from the state police, guys and girls from the state police, additional personnel from the area because the agency just doesn't have enough people to manage a large scale incident. And EMS joined in with that. And we just, once the crowd formed, which was considerably smaller than years past, it was probably less than half, if not a little more. And it took a little longer to form. It was about 1 o'clock before it was really there. Once that crowd formed, we were able to use the camera system from the Ave to observe the crowd and wait for incidents to occur. So there were a couple medical calls, basically 2 medical calls, one that was self-inflicted. Someone thought he could do a backflip off of a roof, a portico roof, and was injured and ended up going to the hospital. And the second ambulance call was for a fight that was later in the evening. It was about 7:30, which is typically what we'll see after 6 or 7 hours of drinking. People's judgment gets worse and they get worn out, and it's easier to tip them off and have a fight break out. So from a public safety perspective, I was very happy with how it was managed. The crowd was smaller. We didn't have any arrests. Actually, there were a couple of arrests that took place out on the road for impaired driving because of the additional personnel that we had come in from the state police and the county. It seems to be the model that will work for us from a public safety standpoint. The Ave did take additional steps this year to try to prevent a crowd from forming. And we had been involved with the meetings with Waterfront Concerts because that's what they brought in. They brought in their people from a crowd management perspective as well. And even those prior meetings, they talked about just trying to make it a little bit harder to get in, delay the start of the large crowd, and then contain that crowd once it formed. So security basically did what we had done in the past. We had kind of made that attempt ourselves inside the Avs. That's where all the people were. And years ago, we would try to break up the smaller groups as they formed. And then when it became unmanageable, we kind of stepped back. So they were able to delay the number of people coming in. They turn around a lot of cars and a lot of people at the entrance. And they're already talking about a plan for next year. I think the neighboring property ended up being the way they accessed the property this year, the way they accessed the property this year. They were able to leave the Ave, go park at Orchard Trails and walk through the woods. So there's already talks with the Ave about actually putting in some fencing and increasing the presence next year with the people from Waterfront Concerts. So from my perspective, we didn't have a lot of problems in town. The crowd was smaller. We didn't make any arrests. And only one person got transported to the hospital. So from my perspective, it was a success.
I saw that gentleman on Instagram. I wondered how that turned out.
I haven't even seen the video. He was knocked unconscious from the fall. He did recover very quickly. He was just struggling to know some of the basic facts of the day. So he was transported to the hospital for that reason. And the second person, while they were injured in a fight, chose to refuse medical treatment and did not consider himself a victim of an assault. So.
Chief, good to hear that more positive report, and really appreciate the preparation that took place before the event, which resulted in a much safer day.
That was the nice thing.
All we hope is there's not a big COVID outbreak as a result of all those people cramming in together.
Fair enough. There was a lot of fraternizing going on, I guess. I did like hearing from the state police that they felt that their presence was helpful, that they see that is a great way to manage this incident. We've learned a couple things for next year regarding some communication things, but they felt that it was a win as well. And even of all people, Alex Gray, who came up from Waterford Concerts, was also speaking very highly of the whole day and how that was managed, mostly from their perspective, but they felt that it was the right thing to do, that it was a success because of the smaller crowd and the shorter duration.
So while we talk about our partnership with the state police, when we say ours, I just want to acknowledge that the Office of Student Life was kind of in the planning with us and a partner at the table. So we really appreciate all that the university did to support this endeavor as well. Since the chief, you done, Chief?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, all right. The one meeting that I want to bring to your attention so it doesn't catch up short when it gets advertised in the paper is on May 19th at 6:30. The Orono Planning Board is going to have a meeting. There is a single item for public hearing and discussion, and that is Red Brick and Mortar Inc. doing business as Firestorm. This is the first business to come through for approvals for retail marijuana. And so I just want to make you aware of that. The location is in the mall, over on Stillwater. So just again, want you, in case you get questioned about it, I have received a call from a person that's interested, really wants us to look at changing the ordinance to allow for more higher density. And I explained that at this point in time, the ordinance has been adopted and council is really, I think, going to take a wait and see approach. However, anybody is welcome to submit a proposal to council if they wish to see a change in zoning law. And then the last thing is I received notification today that I have been appointed to the Maine Public Employees Retirement System Participating Local District Advisory Committee. There we go. MMA has 2 seats. One they use for the person who oversees all of their HR functions and provides support to municipalities, Dave Barrett, and the other one for a town manager. And so I am going to be that person for the next 5 years, and it will be exciting to learn more about public employee retirement. I think that's it.
I don't 48 hours into a 24-hour day, Sophie. You need to teach me how to do that.
Can I just tell you that the key is to find a few things that are just super exciting. I don't know that retirement will be that thing, but I think meeting new people and learning new things is that thing. I think that's where I am. I don't know if people have questions, concerns, things that I need to look into, but I'm around if you need anything.
All right, folks. Well, it is a little past 7. I can smell somebody's cooking bacon in my kitchen, and it's very distracting. And it seems like our meeting is drawn to a close. So all in favor, we can just wave our hands goodbye of adjourning. Bye. Thank you, everyone.